Well, good morning. Welcome to Vintage. If I've never met you before, my name is Dustin Turner. I serve as the lead pastor of Vintage Church, and we are continuing this series that we're calling Prosperous, right? And it's kind of obviously a play on words where we're looking at what does it really mean to prosper in life? What does prosperity really look like, right? Because in our culture, in our world, to prosper or to be prosperous is to accumulate as much money, resource, stuff as you possibly can. But, and I think it's so appropriate, I don't even know if Mark Anthony planned it, right? But in that song, that phrase, so much better your way, right? That phrase speaks to exactly what Paul is talking about in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. Because if we want, we can accumulate all of our stuff. But God's way of thinking about prosperity, to prosper, is not accumulating, but it's giving away. It's generosity. And so what we've been looking at over these last few weeks in this series is what does it look like to prosper biblically? What does it look like to live a life of generosity? I want to encourage you in a couple of ways. Number one, we have a couple resources at our resource center that I've been sharing with you. One is The Treasure Principle by Randy Alcorn, a very basic but practical book on some biblical principles about generosity. The other one is by Art Rayner, The Money Challenge, and this is a super practical book talking about debt, talking about generosity, talking about saving, talking about all of that. And so those are out there if you're interested. Some resources for you. But we kicked off this series doing a little bit of, giving a little bit of context, talking about Paul, Apostle Paul wrote this letter to the Corinthian church. One of the things that Paul was focused on as a Jewish Christian was involving Gentile Christians or non-Jews to support the Jerusalem church. The Jerusalem church was primarily made up of Jewish Christians, and those individuals were, literally what Paul says almost, they were dirt poor. They didn't have much. And so part of what Paul was wanting to do as he went around to these different churches and he started these different churches is he wanted to take up a collection for these poor Jerusalem Christians. And then he was going to take the gift and bring it to them to bless them. And so we've been in 2 Corinthians 8 over the last couple of weeks. Today we're going to be in 2 Corinthians 8, starting in verse 16 through 9:5. If you have a Bible, you can turn there. If you don't have a Bible, lift up your hand and we can get you one of those. But over the last 2 weeks, these are the big ideas that we've looked at. God prospers us not for greed, but for generosity. That was week 1. Week 2, God prospers us not for ourselves, but for Himself and others. And this week, we're going to be answering the question, are you ready to prosper? And I want you to think about life, right? Because we get ready for a lot of stuff. And when it comes to money, I immediately think about things like life insurance and retirement and savings and saving for our children to go to college and all those sorts of things. I remember it was just a few years ago that I finally got life insurance. And I never wanted to think about it because, when you think about life insurance, what are you thinking about? Death. So I'm planning for my demise, right? I'm planning for the moment that I croak and my wife and my kids get whatever they can get out of my death. Is that not true? That's true. And Pastor Brick and I are talking, and he's like, man, you really need to do this. And I'm like 30 at that point. And I'm like, you're right. I'm a type 1 diabetic. At this point, if I die, it's going to be rough, right, for my family. So I go to my guy that helps me with my finances, and he sets me up with life insurance, which, by the way, for a type 1 diabetic is not easy to get. But needless to say, I have life insurance. We plan for these things, right? We invest our money. We think about our savings, and we think about even saving for purchases. We plan for those things. But the question that I want you to think about this morning is if we're getting ready to retire or die in the future and be there for our families, why aren't we planning to be generous? Why aren't we intentionally thinking about what is it going to take in my life? What is it going to take in our lives to be generous? Not, right? Because often when we think about generosity, we think about, okay, what do I have left that I can put and give to them, right? When you're driving by and you see the homeless person and you're like, oh man, just scrounging for change or $1, right? Or here at Vintage, right? The baskets are being passed. Hurry, get your checkbook out, get your cash out. You're thinking about what you can just give in that moment instead of, just like everything else in life, planning for generosity. And that's exactly what Paul is getting at here in 2 Corinthians 8, 16 through 9:5. Now, I want to encourage you. Pastor Brick and his wife Sarah already talked about it. I really want you to be here Tuesday night for Make Space, practical advice on debt, financial freedom, and generosity. And what I'm most excited about is the next slide. My picture's not up there. For two reasons. Number one, I just want to sit and consume the knowledge that's going to be given. And number two, of all the things in life, you don't want me talking about the ins and outs of money with you, because I'm not going to be helpful to you in the least bit. And so I'm really excited about Tuesday night right here. We also, and we don't even have pictures for all of these. We have 2 panels of other individuals who are really, really great with their finances. They are CPAs. They serve in the financial world. And so we've got a lot planned for Tuesday night. We have those sign-up sheets out in the lobby. Please sign up so we know if you need childcare and we know how much food to purchase so you can be here. But the reason I'm so excited about this is because so many of us are not ready to be generous because we're working on paying off our debt. We're working on figuring out how to budget wisely. And so part of our need to be generous and our desire to be generous has to be supplemented with this, so that we can make space in our budget and in our lives to actually live generously. And so I really want to encourage you, be here Tuesday night from 6 to 8:30. What I want you to get this morning, this is the big idea that I think Paul talks about in this passage. He says this: God prospers us not to talk about generosity, but to live generously. Not just to talk about it, but to actually do it. In my mind, this is where Paul says it's time to put up or shut up, right? I mean, he's been encouraging them, loving them, and saying, you guys really need to be generous. I know that you can do this. And in this moment, he says, now it's time to stop talking about it and actually do it. And so let's look at 2 Corinthians 8, starting in verse 16 together. And this is what Paul writes to the Corinthians. He says, but thanks be to God who put into the heart of Titus the same earnest care I have for you. For he not only accepted our appeal, but being himself very earnest, he is going to you of his own accord. With him, we are sending the brother who is famous among all the churches for his preaching of the gospel. And not only that, but he has been appointed by the churches to travel with us as we carry out this act of grace that is being ministered by us for the glory of the Lord himself and to show our goodwill. We take this course so that no one should blame us about this generous gift that is being administered by us. For we aim at what is honorable, not only in the Lord's sight, but also in the sight of man. And with them we are sending our brother, whom we have often tested and found earnest in many matters, but who is now more earnest than ever because of his great confidence in you. As for Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker for your benefit. And as for our brothers, they are messengers of the churches, the glory of Christ. So give proof before the churches of your love and of our boasting about you to these men. Verse 1 in chapter 9. Now it is superfluous for me to write to you about the ministry for the saints. For I know your readiness, of which I boast about you to the people of Macedonia, saying that Achaia has been ready since last year. And your zeal has stirred up most of them, but I am sending the brothers so that our boasting about you may not prove empty in this matter, so that you may be ready as I said you would be. Otherwise, if some Macedonians come with me and find that you are not ready, we would be humiliated, to say nothing of you, for being so confident. So I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to go on ahead to you and arrange in advance for the gift you have promised, so that it may be ready as a willing gift, not as an exaction. And so the question that I want us to think about this morning is, are you ready to prosper? And here's what I think Paul says to us. Are you ready to prosper? If so, number one, anticipate to be expected. Anticipate to be expected. Now, there's a lot going on that we don't have all the time in the world to talk about in verses 16 through 24, right? What is going on here is Paul is saying, listen, I'm expecting you to be generous. How do we know that? Because what Paul talks about is he talks about sending a group of people, an envoy. We know at least Titus, right? Titus, we've been talking about. He was one of Paul's travel companions. He was a pastor with Paul of some other churches in the area. But then Paul writes about two other brothers, the famous brother and the tested brother. Now, we could spend literally all morning guessing who those men were. We have no idea. We just know, here's what we do know. The Corinthians knew who they were, because Paul doesn't need to name them. He just says, here's the tested brother, here's the famous brother, and here is Titus. The point that Paul is trying to make is he is wanting them to be ready, to be expected to give. Why? Because he is sending this group of people to make the collection. Expectations are always huge, right? Whenever Rachel and I have premarital counseling with people, one of the things that we literally talk about for every session, we typically have 4 sessions before the wedding and then a post session. And every time that we meet with a couple, we talk about expectations. Because I'm serious, 9 times out of 10, the reason that there's an argument or a conflict or a dispute in a marriage is because the expectations between the husband and the wife weren't clear. So it's like, hey, listen, I grew up and my dad took out the trash, and so I just assumed you were going to take out the trash this week, and then the trash doesn't get taken out. The dishes don't get done. Who pays the bills? And if you don't talk about those expectations, man, conflict arises, right? And the problem is, if you don't talk about these little teeny tiny disagreements over a long period of time, they blossom and escalate into this crazy, ridiculous conflict. And that's exactly what is going on here. Paul is trying to make clear to the Corinthians what his expectation is of them, that they would be generous. Remember, if you go back last week when we talked about in 2 Corinthians 8, they had begun to take up a collection for the Corinthians. So they knew that it was expected of them that they would give. And so Paul is just simply reminding them that if you're going to be ready to prosper, if you are going to be generous, then as Christians, we should anticipate that generosity is expected. Something you're going to hear me say a lot is this: Christians should be the most generous people on the planet. You should find no greater generosity than in the church. Why? Because of what we looked at last week. Who is the greatest example of generosity? Jesus. He gave his life for us. He gave literally everything that we would have our eternal life with Christ. And listen, generosity is not easy. I'm sharing all of this with you because it's difficult for me. Do you know who's more generous in my house? It is not me. It is my wife. You can ask Rachel. I'm a hoarder. I'm a healthy hoarder, if that's a way to say. I mean, if it has use, there's no reason to get rid of it, right? Now, Rachel, on the other hand, she will go on a trip, right? When I go on a trip, I'm buying stuff for myself because I want, the stuff that I've gone to this trip. I want to experience it, so I want to bring all this stuff back. She recently went to Waco to the silos, and she had like all of these bags, and only like one bag was hers. All of the other bags were gifts that she had purchased for other people. And I'm like, who goes on vacation or a trip and buys gifts for other people? That's crazy to me, right? Again, you see where I'm going with this, right? I'm not the most generous person in our home. My wife is. And so for some of us, the reality is this: generosity does not come easy. I get it. For some of us, we have this natural tendency to hoard, or we have this natural tendency to worry about money or finances, or maybe you grew up in a very difficult financial situation where it wasn't easy because you didn't have a lot to give away. And so you have a hard time letting go of what God has given you. But what Paul is trying to remind us here is that Christians of all people should be the most generous people on the face of our planet. Why was this generosity expected? Look at what Paul says. He talks about the expectation being for the glory of the Lord and then the goodwill of Paul. And so the whole thing that he's talking about, listen, this generosity, number one, is not to make you look great. It's not for anything other than primarily the glory of God. When we give back, when we are generous, we are first generous to glorify God. But everything we do in life, right? The breath that we take, the way that we live our lives is for the glory of God. And so our generosity is for the glory of God. But Paul also talks about his goodwill. He wanted the churches that he ministered to and the church in Jerusalem to know how much he cared for them. And so he made it a priority to be about this collection so the church at Jerusalem would genuinely know that Paul cares for them. It's part of what we've talked about over the last few weeks, right? Proving our love. That when we are generous, we prove that we love those people who we're generous to. And Paul is reminding us here that yes, we give for the glory of the Lord, but we also give, again, to prove our love, to demonstrate that we love people. Now, the other question I want us to think about with regard to expectation is, why did Paul go to all this trouble? Look at what he says in verses 20 through 21, and this is so important for us today. He says this: we take this course, meaning what he's talking about is I'm sending Titus and these two other brothers for this reason. We take this course so that no one should blame us about this generous gift that is being administered by us. Look at verse 21. For we aim at what is honorable. And this to me is so significant. Not only in the Lord's sight, but also in the sight of man. You see, Paul recognized that this collection was going to be large. Whatever the Corinthians were going to give, Paul's assumption, because of their status, because of how the Lord had blessed them, Paul assumed that this gift was going to be large. And what he wanted more than anything was that when people looked at this gift and looked at what Paul was doing, no one would look and say, hey, Paul's lining his pockets. He wanted to be held above reproach. Which is why Paul brings up multiple times in other authors in the New Testament. Look at 1 Timothy 3:2. When he's talking about being a pastor, Paul says this about pastors or elders. He says, therefore an overseer must be above reproach. The point of being above reproach is that no one could bring a charge against you. Which is why for Paul in 2 Timothy 8, it's not only significant that what he does is honorable before the Lord, but also before men. Because he wants to be above reproach. He wants his churches to be above reproach. 1 Timothy 3:3, as he talks about being above reproach, Paul says that pastors are not to be lovers of money. Titus 1:7, this is a letter he wrote to Titus about raising up pastors and leading the church, that pastors are not to be greedy for gain. 1 Peter 5:2, Peter, the Apostle Peter, writes this to these churches and the pastors: shepherd the flock of God that is among you. For what? Not for shameful gain. Because listen, what's happened not only in our world, but obviously in Paul's world. Money was an issue, right? Week 1, we looked at 1 Timothy 6, where Paul talks about the wealthy, but then he also talks about the love of money. And pastors and church leaders are not exempt from the challenge and the temptation of greed. And so what Paul wants more than anything is to say, listen, you're to be generous, church, And we, as leaders of the church, are doing everything we can to make sure that in the eyes of both God and man, this collection that we're taking is honorable. That it is for those churches that need it most. And listen, here's the reality, right? In our world, you probably have seen, maybe personally or at least online or in television, pastors who have been greedy for gain. Pastors who have struggled with greed and honestly, at the end of the day, do what they do to get as much money as they can. And for me, as the lead pastor of Vintage Church, here's what I want you to hear, and I want you to know, because this is so significant for us, that as the lead pastor of Vintage Church, it's always both my desire and my responsibility to steward well the Lord's resources. That's important because every single thing that you and I give back to the local church, it belongs to whom first? God. So it's my responsibility to steward well the Lord's resources that we together have faithfully and trustingly given to Vintage Church. And so generosity for Paul and for us is expected. But we have to do everything that we can. I have to do everything I can as the lead pastor of Vintage Church to make sure that we steward those resources well for the glory of God. That when people would look at our church, they would look at our giving, they would look at how we steward our giving, they would say that is both honorable in the sight of God. God is glorified in that. But also when men, when women, when people look at our finances and our resources, they would say how they're stewarding them is they're doing well. It's honorable. So our generosity, it's expected. God prospers us not to talk about generosity, but to live generously. Are you ready to prosper? I think the next thing that Paul says, starting in verse 1 in chapter 9, is that we need to anticipate to be ready. Not only that generosity is to be expected, but that we need to be ready to be generous. Look at what Paul says in verses 1 through 3. He says, "Now it is superfluous for me to write to you about the ministry for the saints, or that collection for the churches in Jerusalem. For I know your" what? Okay, let's say that together. "For I know your readiness, of which I boast about you to the people of Macedonia, saying that Achaia is the region in which the city of Corinth is, saying that Achaia has been ready," what? What have they been? Ready since last year. "And your zeal, your desire, your readiness to give has stirred up most of them." These other churches that are poor and have less resources, because the Corinthians are excited and ready to give, the other ones are encouraged to give. Verse 3, "But I am sending the brothers so that our boasting about you may not prove empty in this matter, so that you may be" what? "Ready, as I said you would be." 3 times in 3 verses, Paul talks about the Corinthians being ready to be generous. Meaning, when Titus and the faithful brother and the tested brother get there, their money is set aside to put in the box to send to Jerusalem. That they would be ready to be generous. There's one thing in life that I hate almost more than anything else. It's being late. Anybody else? How many of you, this is a serious question, how many of you is being on time being late? There's just not enough hands raised right now. You do understand, right, that to be early is to be on time. And to be on time is to be late. Right, and I know that most of you don't believe that because most of you get here at 9:15 when the welcome is already over, right? You've missed 2 or 3 songs. Right, that's an expectation that I have. I hate being late. I love being early, which means I'm on time. And that's exactly what Paul is saying here. There's a readiness that the Corinthians are to have. That when Titus and these two brothers get there, they're not like scrambling, oh, we didn't know you were coming, guys. But that they are ready when they get there to give this gift, to be generous to these churches. And what Paul says is, listen, the Corinthians, you have been ready. They've been ready. Now what Paul is doing is he's proving their readiness. If you started this collection and you say that you're good to go, you're ready, let's see what you do when Titus and these brothers get to you. So he's telling the Macedonians about the readiness of the Corinthians, and now he's sending these people to the Corinthians that they might collect. And for you and I want you to think about this question: why should we always be ready? Why should we always be ready? Why should we be like the Corinthians? I think the significance of always being ready to be generous is that, always being ready is that so we can always be generous. Because there's a reality, right, that some of our generosity is planned. I hope one of the things that we talk about often, we've talked about in this series often, is making your generosity regular. And we're going to talk about that in just a second, that you would give regularly to the local church, or if you have other organizations that you give to, that you would give regularly. Why? Because the church, right, the church rests on your regularity in giving. That's how we make our budget. That's how we plan what we are doing. But here's the other reality about generosity, right? Things come up. There are needs that arise that if you're not ready to be generous, you're not going to be able to be generous. And look, I mean, we've got a car wash out here, right? Today, they're washing cars for this Guatemala mission trip. And so part of that is like, maybe you weren't coming ready to get your car washed and give generously. But if you think about how you can always be ready to be generous, it doesn't matter what the opportunity is. It doesn't matter what the need is. Immediately, because you're ready, you're able to be generous. And I think that's part of what Paul is saying to us, is that our readiness in giving will prove our generosity. I've already said it, but I think it's important to say again, Christians, we should be the most generous people on the face of the planet. And so if Christians are to be the most generous people, if we are to be the most generous people, then that means we have to be ready to be generous. God prospers us not to talk about generosity, but to live generously. Lastly, are you ready to prosper? Then I think you need to anticipate to be generous. Look at verses 4 and 5 of chapter 9. Otherwise, if some Macedonians come with me and find that you are not ready, we would be humiliated, to say nothing of you, for being so confident. So I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to go on ahead to you and arrange in advance for the gift you have promised, so that it may be ready as a willing gift, not as an exaction. So part of our generosity is that we would anticipate being generous. Not only that we would expect it, not only that we would be ready, but then we would actually do it. And part of what is going on here, and again, I want you to see what Paul is doing here. Because when we talk about money, right, we had a conversation this past week in our V group, and like the group was kind of at first kind of struggling because they were all like, no one really likes to talk about money. Well, why? And so we started talking about all of these reasons. But look at what Paul does here. Some of us, man, we would be ashamed to talk about generosity and giving with other people the way that Paul does. But in Paul's day, in the Corinthians' day, honor and shame were significant. They lived in an honor-shame culture. If you go to the East, the Eastern world, right, in the Middle East and China and Asia and those sorts of places, they live in an honor-shame culture. And what they're desiring is to remove shame, to avoid shame, and when possible, bring honor to themselves, but more significantly, to their families. And so Paul is living in this honor-shame culture. And what he's saying is he's bringing up this whole honor-shame element. And what he's saying is, listen, if you guys aren't going to be generous, you are going to shame me. Now some of us are like, Paul, I can't believe you would say that. But that's what he says. And then what does he say? To say nothing of you. So what he's saying here is, listen, if you guys aren't going to be generous, you are going to shame me, because I've already told the Macedonians how ready you are to be generous. But you're not only going to shame me, you're going to shame yourselves. Because you said you were ready to be generous, and now's the opportunity to be generous. One commentator says it like this. He says, the Corinthian people lived within an honor-shame cultural orientation, where public recognition was often more important than facts, and where the worst thing that could happen was for one's reputation to be publicly tarnished. In such a culture, a person's sense of worth is based on a recognition by others of one's accomplishments. And that's exactly what Paul is doing here. He's saying, listen, if you guys aren't ready to be generous, you're not going to be generous. The Macedonians and all of these other Christians who I have told to them about how generous you guys are ready to be, I'm going to be shamed. You're going to be shamed. I think I might start actually doing that. I'm going to start going on social media and naming names. Like these people, they told me today they were so ready to be generous. Could you imagine? That's part of what Paul is doing here. And that's how serious he takes the Corinthians being generous. So when is it generosity? Do you see what Paul says at the end of these verses in verse 5? He says, listen, so I thought it necessary to urge the brothers, this team, to go on ahead and arrange in advance for this gift you have promised. Two things really quickly. Number one, it was a gift. And number two, this was something that the Corinthians had promised. And so what he then goes on to say, so that it may be ready as a willing gift, not as an exaction. Our generosity should not be like paying bills. Anybody love paying bills? Okay, good. There's none of you that are really weird and sick people, right? I mean, no one wants to pay bills, right? Paying bills is terrible. I hate paying bills. But what Paul is saying is like, listen, our generosity should not feel like we're writing a check to pay for that bill, but it should feel like giving a gift. And listen, if you don't like giving gifts, come talk to my wife and she will tell you what joy it brings her to give gifts. And what Paul is saying is that's what our generosity should do. That when we are generous with our time, money, energy, and resources, it's like a gift that we are willingly giving and not being forced to give. And so for us, again, it comes back to how do we practice generosity? I've shared these the last couple of weeks, but I think it's so important for us to keep reiterating. Number one, we begin giving. The most important thing that we can do to practice generosity is not wait to get everything in order. It's not waiting to create margin to give more, but it's simply looking at what we have now and beginning to give. We talk about this, again, the generosity ladder. You've heard me talk about this for 3 weeks. Why? Because I think it's that significant and that practical. For some of us, we just need to begin giving. You can't be generous if you've never begun to give. So you simply begin giving. How do we practice generosity? Begin giving. Number two, then you create margin to be more generous. So you begin practicing generosity, and then what you're able to do, right? Because Christians are what? The most generous people on the face of the earth. Why? Because of what Jesus has done for us. So then we begin to look at all of our resources and say, how can I create more margin in my life so that I can be more generous with what God has given us? And that's why we talk about then, if you've given before, maybe it's talking about being intentional. Creating more margin allows you to be more intentional with your giving, where you're going to say, not only am I going to give, but I'm going to give once a month, and it's going to be 3%, 5%, 7%. And then you step up your giving where it's more faithful, where you're giving 10% every month. where you get to the extravagant giving, where it's above and beyond 10%. And over the last 2 weeks, I've talked about what I think about tithing. That tithing is, yes, Old Testament, but Jesus promotes and encourages and demonstrates for us what true generosity looks like. That we give everything that we have. Which again, that's why I just want to encourage you. Be here on Tuesday night. Because some of you are like, I want to be generous, but I have no idea how to create margin in my life. And that's what this night is for. To help you create margin to be more generous with what God has given you. So we begin giving, we create margin to be more generous, and then we make our generosity regular. That's where I'm talking about intentional giving, faithful giving, and extravagant giving. Why? Because I think regular giving makes generosity a lifestyle. Regular giving makes generosity a lifestyle. If you're not giving regularly, then generosity is not a part of who you are and what you do. But if you create margin in your life to where you're then able to give regularly, it's a part of who you are. It becomes a part of your lifestyle. And just briefly, I want to share this because I think it's so important for us. We've talked about generosity generally. And I think that there are so many different organizations and groups and people that you can be generous with. But I want to just briefly share why I believe the church is the first place you should be generous. Because the church is the primary means by which the kingdom of God is expanding in our world. And therefore, and that's if we are Christians, if we are followers of Jesus, the most important thing that we should want in our world is for the kingdom of God to beat the kingdom of darkness. Amen? And so the most important place and organization and group that we should promote and encourage and be generous with is the church. That's not to say, hear me out, it's not to say we shouldn't practice generosity with other groups and other people. But I think first and foremost, you should prioritize the church in your generosity because the mission is that important. So how do we practice generosity? We begin giving, we create margin to be generous, we make our generosity regular. I want to say it one more time. Christians should be the most generous people on the face of the planet. Because God, through His Son Jesus, has given us literally everything. And so our lives should be marked by generosity. So to recap, are you ready to prosper? Then we need to anticipate to be expected, that generosity would be expected of us, that we need to anticipate to be ready, that the moment when we're able to be generous, that we would be ready to be generous, and then anticipate to be generous, to actually carry out the act of generosity. Because God prospers us not to talk about generosity, but to live generously. Let's not just talk about it. Let's also be about it. So how will we respond this morning? 4 simple steps that we've talked about each week that I want to remind you of. Number 1, you thank God for His generosity. Everything that you have is God's. And He's given it to you as a gift, not to own, but to steward. It's not yours. And so you take a moment and you thank God for His generosity. Number 2, check your heart. We've talked a lot this morning about practical steps to create margin, to be more generous. But for some of us, it's not about creating margin. It's about checking our hearts because our hearts struggle with greed. And one of the most important things that we need to do is do work with the Lord to ask Him to remove the greed from our hearts. Just FYI, my hoarding is not holy hoarding. There's a little bit of greed in there that I've got to constantly rip out. Check your heart. Number 3, take steps to become generous. What do you need to do now where you can increase your generosity? And lastly, give generously. Don't wait. Don't say, I'm going to think about it. Begin to live generously. Give generously to the church. Give generously to organizations. Give generously to people. Be generous with your life. Because God has prospered us not to talk about generosity, but to live generously. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your generosity. Father, that you have given us literally every single thing, including the breath in our lungs. And so first and foremost, God, we simply thank you that you have been so generous to us, God, in creating us, in sustaining us, and ultimately in saving us through your Son, Jesus. God, I pray that in this moment, as we're about to respond, Father, that you would, God, allow us to search and know our hearts, to check our hearts, God, to see if there is greed in them. And God, if there is, God, that you would remove that greed. God, help us to live and be generous. God, help us now in this moment, God, to be generous with our money, to be generous with our time, to be generous with our energy. God, help us to take active steps to begin to create more margin in our lives so that we can actually be more generous with what you've given us. And so, Father, as we respond to you, God, we just simply ask that you would move and work in our hearts and lives. And we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.